The year was 1305, and the cobblestone streets of London had witnessed countless executions. But nothing would prepare the gathered crowds for what they were about to see. As dawn broke over the medieval city, thousands of spectators pressed against barriers, vendors hawked their wares, and the air buzzed with anticipation. They had come to witness the death of a man whose name had struck fear into the hearts of English nobles and inspired hope in Scottish peasants. But what unfolded that August morning would become one of history's most horrifying displays of state-sanctioned brutality. The popular image of William Wallace's death has been sanitized by Hollywood and romantic literature. We've been fed a noble narrative of a brave hero meeting his end with dignity, perhaps even defiance. But the reality was far more sinister, far more calculated, and infinitely more cruel than anything you've seen on screen. King Edward Longshanks didn't simply want Wallace dead. He wanted to create a spectacle so terrifying that it would haunt the collective memory of Scotland for generations. What I'm about to reveal isn't just another retelling of a medieval execution. This is the unflinching truth about how political power wielded torture as theater, how a man's body became a canvas for royal vengeance, and how the very method chosen for Wallace's death was designed to destroy not just life, but human dignity itself. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand why Wallace's execution remains one of the most brutal judicial murders in recorded history, and why the details were so horrific that chroniclers of the time struggled to document them without trembling hands. The method selected for Wallace wasn't merely execution, it was systematic annihilation. Hanging, drawing, and quartering represented the absolute pinnacle of medieval judicial cruelty, reserved for traitors who had committed the unforgivable sin of defying the crown. But even within this category of punishment, what happened to Wallace pushed the boundaries of human suffering to their absolute limits. To understand the full horror of what transpired, we must first grasp the world that created such brutality. Medieval England in 1305 was a realm where royal authority was maintained through fear as much as loyalty. Public executions weren't just about justice. They were carefully orchestrated performances designed to demonstrate the consequences of challenging the established order. The crowd wasn't merely witnessing punishment. They were participating in a ritual of state power that reinforced social hierarchies through shared trauma. Edward I had earned his reputation as one of England's most ruthless monarchs through systematic campaigns of conquest and suppression. His subjugation of Wales had been marked by extraordinary violence, and his expulsion of England's Jewish population demonstrated his willingness to use extreme measures to consolidate power. When it came to Scotland, Edward saw not a neighboring kingdom deserving respect, but a rebellious province that required correction through overwhelming force. The political context surrounding Wallace's capture and execution reveals the calculated nature of his punishment. By 1305, most Scottish nobles had submitted to English rule, choosing survival over resistance. Wallace's continued defiance made him more than just a military threat. He had become a living symbol of Scottish independence, a constant reminder that Edward's conquest remained incomplete. His very existence challenged the legitimacy of Scotland's surrender and inspired others to question English authority. The hunt for William Wallace had consumed years and vast resources. Edward's administration had constructed an extensive network of spies and informants throughout Scotland, offering substantial rewards for information leading to Wallace's capture. Former allies were turned through a combination of bribes and threats, while collaborators were promised positions in the new English-controlled Scottish government. The net gradually tightened as fear and self-interest overcame loyalty and patriotism. When the betrayal finally came, it arrived through familiar channels of treachery. Wallace was captured near Glasgow, likely through the actions of Sir John Menteith, a Scottish knight who had submitted to English authority and saw personal advantage in delivering Scotland's most wanted rebel. The exact circumstances remain debated by historians, but contemporary accounts suggest Wallace was taken by surprise, possibly during a clandestine meeting with potential supporters who who had already been compromised. The journey from Scotland to London became its own form of torture, carefully designed to break Wallace's spirit before the final act. He was bound and heavily guarded, paraded through English towns where crowds gathered to see the infamous Scottish rebel. This psychological warfare transformed a hero into a spectacle, a leader into a curiosity for English entertainment. Each mile toward London represented another step in his dehumanization, a process that would culminate in the ultimate degradation of public execution. Contemporary chroniclers noted the deliberate cruelty of this procession. Wallace was displayed in chains, forced to endure the jeers and abuse of crowds who had been encouraged to view him as a dangerous criminal, rather than a warrior fighting for his homeland's freedom. The English authorities understood that controlling the narrative was as important as controlling the prisoner. They needed Wallace to appear defeated and pathetic before he reached the execution ground. By the time Wallace arrived in London, he had already endured weeks of physical and psychological torment. But his ordeal was only beginning. The English legal system was about to demonstrate its capacity for transforming justice into vengeance, law into theater, and punishment into art of the most horrific kind. The trial itself was a masterpiece of legal fiction. Held at Westminster Hall on August 23, 1305, the proceedings were conducted entirely in Latin, a language Wallace likely didn't understand. He faced charges of treason, murder, sacrilege, arson, and various other crimes against the English crown. The irony wasn't lost on contemporary observers. Wallace was being tried for treason against a king he had never acknowledged as his sovereign. When given the opportunity to speak, Wallace reportedly declared he could never be guilty of treason against Edward because he had never been Edward's subject. This defiant response, while legally sound, sealed his fate. The judges, all appointed by Edward, had no intention of showing mercy. The trial was theater designed to provide a legal veneer for what was essentially predetermined execution. The charges against Wallace were carefully crafted to justify the severity of his intended punishment. Treason was the most serious offense, punishable by the full horror of hanging, drawing, and quartering. Additional charges of murder and sacrilege, referring to his attacks on English soldiers and clergy, were meant to portray him as a criminal rather than a warrior. The English legal system had become a weapon of state terror, and Wallace was to be its most prominent victim. The sentence was pronounced with ceremonial gravity that belied its predetermined nature. Wallace was to be drawn through the streets of London, hanged by the neck, but not until dead, disemboweled while still alive, beheaded, and his body cut into 4 parts. Each element of this punishment carried symbolic meaning that extended far beyond simple execution. The drawing represented his degradation from man to beast, the hanging his rejection by heaven, the disemboweling his spiritual corruption, and the quartering his complete destruction as both person and symbol. This wasn't merely about ending a life. It was about the systematic obliteration of everything Wallace represented. Edward understood that symbols could be as powerful as armies, and he intended to transform Wallace's death into a symbol of English dominance so terrifying that it would prevent future rebellions before they could begin. The methodology of the execution had been refined over centuries to maximize both physical agony and psychological impact on witnesses, but what happened next would surpass even Edward's sadistic imagination. The morning of August 23rd dawned clear and warm, providing perfect conditions for what the English authorities had planned as the execution event of the century. London had been preparing for days, with scaffolds erected specifically for this occasion and vendors setting up stalls to serve the anticipated crowds. This wasn't simply about justice. It had become a public holiday, complete with entertainment and refreshments for those gathered to witness human suffering on an unprecedented scale. Wallace was first stripped naked and bound to a hurdle, a wooden frame designed to drag condemned prisoners through the streets. The route had been meticulously planned to maximize both humiliation and spectacle, winding through London's busiest districts to ensure maximum exposure. From the Tower of London, where he had been held, the procession moved slowly through crowded marketplaces and residential areas, allowing as many people as possible to witness his degradation. The cobblestones tore at Wallace's flesh as he was dragged behind horses, leaving a trail of blood that marked his final journey through the English capital. Contemporary accounts describe the crowds as a mixture of curiosity seekers, English patriots celebrating their victory, and those who simply enjoyed witnessing suffering. Medieval executions served dual purposes as both entertainment and stark demonstrations of royal power, and the authorities actively encouraged the crowd's participation in Wallace's humiliation. Spectators lined the streets, jeering and throwing refuse at the bound prisoner as he passed. Their behavior was not spontaneous, but deliberately encouraged by English officials who wanted to ensure Wallace's final hours were as degrading as possible. This was state-sponsored cruelty orchestrated on a massive scale, designed to transform a symbol of resistance into an object of contempt and pity. The procession moved deliberately slowly, allowing maximum time for crowds to gather and for Wallace's suffering to be prolonged. Witnesses noted that he remained conscious throughout this ordeal, his eyes fixed on some distant point, as if seeing beyond the immediate horror of his situation. Whether this represented defiance, resignation, or simple shock remains unknown to history. What contemporary chroniclers did record was his refusal to cry out or beg for mercy, a detail that would later become part of his enduring legend. At Smithfield, London's traditional execution ground, an elaborate scaffold had been erected specifically for Wallace's death. The crowd here was even larger and more enthusiastic than along the route, with vendors selling pies and ale to spectators who had claimed prime viewing positions hours earlier. The carnival atmosphere was entirely deliberate. English authorities wanted Wallace's death remembered not as martyrdom, but as a celebration of English justice and power. The executioner who awaited Wallace was a master craftsman of death, a professional who had likely performed dozens of such elaborate killings. His skill lay not simply in causing maximum pain, but in keeping victims alive and conscious for as long as possible. Death would come as a release, not as the culmination of suffering, and that release would be delayed until every possible moment of agony had been extracted. Wallace was first suspended from a rope positioned carefully to ensure slow strangulation rather than the quick death that would come from breaking the neck. The crowd watched in fascination as he struggled for breath, his face turning purple, his body convulsing in the universal dance of asphyxiation. But just as consciousness began to fade, just as merciful darkness threatened to claim him, he was cut down, still alive, still aware of what was happening to him. What followed represented the most horrific phase of the entire ordeal. While Wallace remained conscious and alert, the executioner began the process of disemboweling him with surgical precision. Using a razor-sharp knife, he cut open the abdomen and began removing internal organs one by one. Contemporary accounts describe screams that seemed to emerge from the very depths of human suffering, sounds that witnesses claimed haunted their dreams for years afterward. The executioner held up each organ for the crowd's inspection before casting it into a fire that had been prepared specifically for this purpose. The symbolism was not accidental. In medieval thought, the bowels were considered the seat of human emotion and compassion. By burning them while Wallace watched, the executioner was symbolically destroying his humanity, reducing him to something less than human in the eyes of the assembled masses. The smell of burning flesh and organs filled the air, adding another sensory layer of horror to an already nightmarish scene. Through all of this systematic destruction, Wallace remained conscious, his eyes open and aware, even as his body was methodically dismantled. Some accounts suggest he continued to speak, though his words have been lost to history. The executioner's expertise lay in maintaining life while destroying it, keeping the victim alert for every moment of his own annihilation. Finally, mercifully, the executioner moved to complete his grisly masterpiece. Wallace's head was severed with a single stroke of a sharp axe, ending his suffering at last after hours of unimaginable torment. But even in death, the humiliation continued with calculated precision. His head was held aloft for the crowd's final viewing, blood still dripping from the severed neck, before being set aside for preservation and display. The body was then quartered with the same methodical care that had characterized the entire execution. Each piece was held up for inspection, like cuts of meat in a butcher's shop, the crowd cheering with each fresh display of carnage. This final degradation completed Wallace's transformation from national hero to political object lesson, from symbol of resistance to warning against rebellion. The disposal of Wallace's remains followed a script written by Edward himself, designed to extend the execution's psychological impact far beyond London. His head was dipped in tar for preservation and mounted on a spike atop London Bridge, where it would remain visible to all who entered the capital for years to come. The 4 quarters of his body were dispatched to different Scottish cities, Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, where they were displayed publicly as permanent reminders of English power and the consequences of defying it. The brutal spectacle of William Wallace's execution was meant to extinguish Scottish resistance forever, to transform a symbol of hope into a monument of terror. Edward Longshanks believed that such overwhelming cruelty would break the spirit of any who dared challenge English authority. But history would prove him catastrophically wrong. The very excess of Wallace's torture became the seed of something far more dangerous to English rule. A martyr whose suffering transcended death itself. The crowds who gathered to witness entertainment found themselves confronting something that would haunt their dreams for decades. The calculated brutality that was supposed to demonstrate English power instead revealed its fundamental weakness. The need to resort to such monstrous methods exposed the fragility of Edward's conquest. Rather than crushing Scottish resistance, Wallace's horrific death became its rallying cry, inspiring Robert the Bruce and countless others to take up arms against English tyranny. Today, more than 7 centuries later, Wallace's name still echoes as a symbol of resistance against oppression. The man who was meant to be forgotten, whose body was scattered to the winds as a warning, achieved the very immortality his executioners sought to deny him. His death reminds us that true power lies not in the ability to inflict suffering, but in the courage to endure it for something greater than ourselves. In the end, Edward's elaborate theater of cruelty succeeded only in creating the very legend it was designed to destroy.